Okay. Let's get started. Alright, so we finished with the three orders: laboratories, bellatores, oratores, those who work, those who fight, and those who pray, which is really going to be how Europe is ordered well up into at least the French Revolution. So, while we're not going to get quite that far this semester, and we're going to start next semester a little prior to the French Revolution, these three orders will come up again. So if you're here in the spring, keep these in mind. They're going to come up again. All right. So, moving on to monastery reforms. So as we get into the 10th century, which would be, I guess, 1100s at this point. No, sorry, 900s. I keep forgetting how that works. It's the other way around. It's 900s. Monasteries are becoming more lax, corruption, as you're getting money and having, less to do, it's just easy to just let things slide and do whatever you want. So in 910, a monastery was founded in Burgundy by Duke William of Aquitaine, as well along with his wife. So they conceived this idea to get rid of corruption by making monasteries beholden to the Pope as opposed to the local government. Now, this is actually a thing that even to this day is like a major part of Catholicism, where the local church, I guess you'd say, politics would be focused on the papacy and papal doctrine rather than whatever the local government wanted. So this meant specifically that as we saw with Otto the Great, the government wasn't giving titles to bishops and monks and administering church lands. This was going back to the papacy. So this led to a series of church reforms all throughout Francia. Population thought this was a great idea, so Coligny was given lots of land and money, and the church grew in power significantly. Because, even the regular people could see that the church was corrupt and not doing anything for the people, and the idea of going back to, just following the Pope and centering on Christendom, as it were, resonated with a lot of people. So we have here a map of the major reform. So you have, of course, Cluny in the middle, and then they spread all throughout. It mentions also Fleury here, but Phil doesn't really talk about that, so don't worry about it. It did also spread to England, even way up here, and then, of course, even down to Rome to a degree as well. So you've got the main churches here in the squares, the, quote, principal daughter churches, and the centers of reform in the triangles, and then the circles are independent priories that just sort of followed along with this. So this is pretty neat to see how quickly this spread. And as you can see over here, they're beginning to push the Muslim wars gradually out of Spain. But we'll get to that more later. Speaking of church reform, in 1024 we had the beginning of the Salian kings. They were the Frankish kings, and they pushed in the other direction for church reform, which is to say more government control. So there was the issue of simony, which is purchasing church offices by nobles, which was another issue of like the nobility taking control of the church. Because you could essentially buy a job as like a priest in multiple churches and get paid for multiple churches. And obviously you can only be at one at a time. It was a whole thing. Lots of issues with that. Also at Henry II, 1046, there was a papal dispute. There were 3 popes. This becomes an issue later as well. But basically, there were various people who were elected pope at the same time, and they all, of course, disagreed with one another. So rather than choose one out of the 3, he got rid of all of them and appointed a German cleric instead because, well, Henry II was German, so it worked for him. And also, if he was the one that appointed the Pope, as we've seen before, typically the popes are the ones that appoint these generals, or not generals, appoint the emperors. So if the king is appointing a pope, that's definitely a shift in the balance of power. So finally, we have the Great Schism, or the East-West Schism. 1054, Cardinal Humbert sent a treatise to Constantinople, basically saying, hey, we've got all this papal reform happening over here in the West. You guys need to do it as well. And let's see, if I recall from the book, does it say? No. There was one issue of like, we need to reform by force if necessary, essentially. Maybe that was a different incident. Anyway, this resulted in the East and the West excommunicating each other, which I'll get into what excommunication means a little bit later. And they didn't formally repair this schism until 1965. So all the way up until 1965, the Eastern Orthodox Church and what became the Catholic Church, the Roman Orthodox Church, were essentially at theological war with one another. Obviously, they had gotten over it before then, but it wasn't ever formally fixed until literally the 1900s, which is insane. So here we have essentially the Holy Roman Empire and the lands around it, and then the Byzantine Empire, as well as the Slavic principalities, which becomes the eastern part of western part of Russia. and this is the main split between Roman Orthodoxy and, I guess you say, Greek Orthodoxy, although obviously up here it becomes Russian Orthodoxy because they've got kind of their own thing going on. But yeah, so Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Obviously, here, this kind of shifts eventually to become more Catholic because, well, I mean, it's part of Italy right now. Yeah. All right. So then we have Pope Gregory the Seventh. So this is another Gregory. We had Pope Gregory the Great earlier. This is Pope Gregory the Seventh, and I mean this guy, he could have been another Pope Gregory the Great, but I guess you can only have one. So the investiture controversy. So once again, the church wanted to move back in the other direction, wanted cardinal bishops to be the ones to elect the pope rather than the emperor, because as we had seen, prior to this, the pope was where kings would go to be made legitimate kings or legitimate emperors. But if the emperor was the one who was electing the pope, that would put the pope under the power of the emperor and would really cheapen the office of the pope. But the cardinal bishops, which is to say, the highest office in the church besides the pope, were the ones electing the pope from their own ranks, then the church would be the one in charge of who's putting the pope, up on the throne, so to speak. This resulted in a major rupture between the empire, which is to say the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy. But as we're going to see, the papacy has the chops to back that up. So Pope Gregory VII pushed for a number of reforms, clerical celibacy, because prior to this, many priests were married. Priests or bishops? Priests were often married. Denounced lay investiture of ecclesiastical office holders, and to give you what all that means, lay investiture, once again, is giving or investing of symbols to bishops by lay or secular government officials, which again is to say emperors making bishops, which made the bishops beholden to the emperor and not to the church or the pope. Because when you're in a job that is given to you because the guy likes you, not because it's a job that you applied for with the skills that you have, you're going to want to stay on that guy's good side. If that guy tells you to vote a certain way on a certain council, you're going to be more likely to vote the way that the guy who got you that job tells you to vote. Whereas if the Pope is the one that makes all the decisions, everyone's going to follow the beat of the drum of the Pope, which is, for the church at least, the way to keep the church unified, rather than split among the whims of the various kingdoms. So we have Pope Gregory the Seventh again. Another great picture of like bird jump scare. Always makes me laugh. Okay, so this is where we get the so-called imperial papacy, and this is kind of the reason why I'm like, well, maybe Pope Gregory, this one should have been called the Great, but I don't know. Anyway, this is, again, Pope Gregory the Seventh. King Henry IV opposed the Pope taking more power. So there was a bishop being elected in Milan, or appointed in Milan, I should say. Elected implies people are voting for him. Appointed in Milan. So Henry marched on the city to chase out the Pope's candidate. Because, if you're in a city and you hear, oh, by the way, the king of the region is coming in with his army to chase you out, the best course of action will be to get the hell out, because you don't want the king and his army to catch you. They may not kill you, but they might throw you in some dank, dirty prison, and you might die anyway. So Gregory excommunicated Henry. Now, we mentioned excommunication earlier, and I didn't bother to define that because it wouldn't really mean much for the whole, the East and West excommunicated each other. That doesn't mean anything, not really. But when the Pope excommunicates this king, now it means something. So what it means is that all Christians were no longer bound by King Henry's commands. And since this is the Middle Ages, and everyone is essentially a good Christian now, especially, nobility and the people that are in high offices, it means that none of his vassals, none of his knights, none of his servants even are bound by law to him anymore. Because when you're excommunicated, excommunication is the church version of being declared an outlaw. And I'm sure we've all seen enough Westerns to know to at least have heard the term outlaw. But the definition of an outlaw is that you are outside the law. And that essentially means that if you come into a town and some dude shoots you, you just shoot you in the middle of the street dead, there is no repercussion. If you're considered an outlaw, you are no longer protected by the law. So if you're excommunicated, you're no longer protected by the church. And back then, the church kind of was the law. So with none of Henry's kingdom basically bound to him by the church's law, a civil war broke out, and also his neighbors, his neighboring nations, attacked him from pretty much all sides because, hey, free land, essentially. Because, well, hey, the Pope excommunicated him, and therefore he's no longer protected by the church's laws. So this land is basically no longer occupied by a Christian king. Now, all that said, Henry did manage to get back in the church's good graces because the Pope did have to forgive sinners, but that did mean Henry had to basically grovel before the Pope and beg for forgiveness. And essentially admit total defeat. Because if the papacy can do that, what are you going to do? You can't send your army against the papacy, because if you're leading your army and the Pope's just like, hey, you're excommunicated, the army can just can literally eat you. I mean, I was going to use that as metaphorically, oh, well, they can just stab you and leave you in the road to die. But they could literally eat you, cannibalistically eat you, and the church would be like, well, that was messed up, but there's no law against that because he's excommunicated. So this proved that the papacy had a lot of power, but also widened the rift between the church and the kings, because the papacy is kind of scary now. They're an international power, and they are now showing with this amount of power that they are more powerful than the kings. That all they've got to do is, hey, well, you you're giving us a hard time. You're excommunicated. Oh, look, your kingdom's falling apart and everyone's attacking you, and you can't. There's nothing you can do diplomatically, unless you fall to your knees and beg for forgiveness and don't do the thing you were doing. See, it's a whole thing. Now, going back a slide, when the East and West excommunicated each other, that doesn't mean anything. It's like saying, oh, well, it's like saying, oh, well, America is saying that everyone in China is an outlaw. Okay, cool. And then China's like, well, everyone in America is an outlaw. Like, neat. Well, what are you going to do? I mean, other than, like, literally going to war over it, which the East and West did not in this case. Now, there's the Protestant Reformation where they did go to war over it, but the East and West did not literally go to war over it. There's nothing, like, really to be done. The East could not tell the Western kings what to do and vice versa. So, it was mostly symbolic. Oh, also, technically, excommunication also means you are cut off from going to heaven. So you definitely want to get back in the good graces of the Pope so that you can go to heaven, because if you get killed while excommunicated, you're not going to make it to heaven. So that's another thing. It's not just a political thing. It's also like, your soul is damned, etc. So here is, actually this isn't even the Pope, this is the Pope's representative offering forgiveness to Henry for making a boo-boo. Alright. Back to the Byzantine Empire, or, Constantinople. They were having a hard time. The dynasty was weakening. There were riots, earthquakes, disease, which, a lot of these we've already gone over, but it's just getting worse. And then also the Great Schism. So the Byzantine Empire is not doing well, to say the least. They're having a bad time. Meanwhile, a Russian prince invaded Byzantine territories. The Byzantine generals rebelled, which is not a good time to have a rebellion of your generals when you're being invaded. So again, not great timing. There's a lot of times in history when it's like, man, how did they even make it as long as they did? These guys, the Byzantine Empire lasts another 400 years. I'll just go ahead and spoil that for you guys. Somehow they last another 400 years. Meanwhile, the Seljuk Turks had been conquering the Islamic lands, uniting the various people and Islamic ideals of territorial expansion and suppression of infidels. So this went beyond Muhammad's original thought of, people of the book, they're not quite where they need to be, but, they're on the right track. So, we can help them. We can help them be where they need to be, but we're not going to butcher them because they're lost. This was a little bit more of the latter. This was more, hey, they're not right, so we need to get rid of them. But also it was just good for territorial expansion because you wipe the people out and hey, free land. 1071, they crushed a Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert. They took the Byzantine emperor prisoner, which was again not great for the Byzantine Empire at least. However, the Seljuk movement was not a 100% all of the Islamic lands were behind them, and that's just the new monolithic thing. Because again, the Muslim lands, the Muslim people were massive, and they had different viewpoints. There was a group called simply the Assassins, who did their best to resist them. I'll get into that in just a second. So here we have the Seljuk Turks. So yeah, you've got the Seljuks here with all this land. This is obviously going to be some important land here in a little bit. The Byzantine Empire, they're really pushing hard against the Byzantines. But you've also got the Fatimids over here in Egypt, which are they're another group of Muslims, but they're not part of the Seljuks. So just to go ahead and show, just from the start, this is a different group. And this is India. I was gonna say I had my brain turned sideways. This is Saudi Arabia here. So yeah. Anyway. And the Assassins, because I had to. Which that's sort of, kind of, loosely what it's based on. Anyway. So, the Byzantine Empire was fighting the Seljuk Turks in the east, and they're also losing what lands they had taken in the west to the Normans. So they were another, actually, I was going to say they were another, Germanic group. I think they were actually, one of the Norse groups of raiders that had come down to settle in the Mediterranean. They were given land in southern Italy because, hey, they're being good mercenaries, and the best way to pay off mercenaries is to give them some land to settle, so they'll leave you alone. By the 1040s, they were expanding into land that was being occupied by the Byzantines, and the papacy, rather than being like, oh, wait, no, you can't do that, we're like, yeah, we're not going to fight this, so, hey, you can have this. You can have this land that belongs to the Byzantine Empire, because we're kind of not seeing eye to eye with them anyway, and they're not able to stop you, and we're sure as hell not going to try to stop you. So you can take it and be happy, and we'll tell you can take it and act like we're magnanimously giving it to you. So sure, all well and good. And this is what I mentioned. This is the region where my friend's bloodline comes from. So despite her being Italian, she's got Norman blood, which means not only does she have Norse, Viking-ish heritage, she also, as we're going to see here in a minute, is somewhat tied to England. So let's get to that. So, as we're getting into the, I don't know what you'd call it, the thousands. As we're in the early 11th century, England was ruled by Ethelred the Unready, which is not a great name to have. He was married to the daughter of the Duke of Normandy. Normandy was, by the way, a region in northern France, again settled by the Normans, but they just had that. They also had that area in southern Italy as well, because you like to spread out. But they were the same. They were the same overall group of people, but the main region they had was, well, Normandy up in northern France. So, the Danes invaded under Sven. Sven's son Canute ended up ruling all of England until 1035. We mentioned Canute already. He was considered crazy and tried to command the ocean. which I don't know how much of that's true because the English really like to exaggerate how great their heroes are and how insane their enemies, how insane and what's the word? Inept their enemies are. So anyway, there was a civil war back in Denmark, so Canute, well, shifted his attention back to Denmark because, there was war to deal with. So the Anglo-Saxons supported Edward the Confessor, who was the son of Ethelred as king. However, the reason he was called Edward the Confessor is due to his apparently very pious nature. And that included, I guess, a vow of celibacy, because he had no sons. And by the 1050s, as he was clearly declining in health, he began making preparations for who was going to take up the crown next. So, one of the men who was supposedly offered the crown was his cousin, William, Duke of Normandy, because he was, related through Edward's mother, who was the daughter of the Duke of Normandy, therefore making his cousin William the Duke of Normandy now. See how that ties in. Genealogy is important with all this nobility crap. I personally haven't watched Game of Thrones, but I feel like that's what we're looking at here is just a bunch of people related, sort of, and now they're all murdering each other for the throne. Anyway, so he was supposedly promised the crown by Edwin. Meanwhile, we had Godwin, Earl of Wessex, who opposed William, and this is but the start. Also, I should mention that Godwin, Earl of Wessex, was told by Edward, on his deathbed, that he was to take over. Again, supposedly, because this was so long ago, it's hard to really have documentation of all this. So both Godwin and Edward claim that, both Godwin and William claim that Edward told them privately that they should be king. So Godwin didn't live much longer. So his son, Harold, took over, amassed lands and power to try to gain the throne. However, apparently, he got himself caught in Norman territory, and in order to become free, he had to become William's vassal. And again, if you recall, in order to be a vassal, you have to pretty much unilaterally support your liege lord. And if William is Harold's liege lord, then you have to support William's claim to the throne. However, Harold said he would, got his freedom, and then when Edward died in 1066, Harold was crowned king. Oops. However, this wasn't complicated enough. Harold Hardrada, not the Harold we've been talking about, but a different Harold, of Norway, who was, I think he was the son of Canute or somewhat related to Canute, was like, "Hey, what do you guys, what have you guys been doing over here? Um, we're still in charge of England this whole time. We've just not been here. We've been busy with other stuff." So he invaded England from the north. William, who went to the Pope first to get authority to invade England, because that's apparently where you get in the authority to invade places. Had about 8,000 Norman soldiers and crossed the Channel to hit England from the south. So Harold, son of Godwin, went north, hit Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge near York, and defeated him. However, at the same time, William was landing in the south, and he had to have a 4-day forced march south to get to William, which, of course, by then his men were exhausted and unable to fight very effectively. So at the Battle of Hastings, the Harold and his army were defeated, and the now named William the Conqueror was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066. And this is where the English and French started hating each other and never stopped. Because technically, William was French, because the Normans are in northern France. So while they are also sort of technically, Norse, they're also sort of technically French. So yeah, 1066 is where it all began. I mean, it's literally a saying in Britain. If they just want shorthand for it's the French's fault, they'll just say, 1066 and all that. Yeah. Also, William the Conqueror has another name he's known by, mostly by the English, William the Bastard, because not only did they just not like him, but apparently he was an illegitimate son. So, yeah, that's the whole thing. So here we have the battles. Harold Hardrada coming in from the north. Harold, son of Godwin, meeting him at Battle of Stamford Bridge, and then marching his way back south to the Battle of Hastings, where he fought William of Normandy and was defeated due to... William of Normandy might have just had a better army. It might not have just been, the 4-day march, it wore him out, so he wasn't able to fight, at full strength. But he certainly wasn't, he certainly was fighting with a disadvantage. Oh, okay. So England was restructured under Norman standards. Land was taken and redistributed to the Norman nobles, which overruled the Anglo-Saxon nobles who had been there before. When I'm not pressed for time, I like to show a couple of little videos here. And since we are pressed for time, I'll just briefly mention them. There's one that's really good. It shows, this guy standing on the shoreline, the wind's blowing in, and and he points to the shoreline. He's like, this is where democracy died. It's like, the Anglo-Saxons didn't have democracy. They were just as much of a kingdom as the Normans were. They just were the local kingdom. It was so dramatic that, and in the way then when he was describing the actual battles, you'd think his dad or his grandfather had died fighting the dirty Normans. It was like, dude, this was literally 1,000 years ago. Almost 1,000 years ago, 1066, But, this was 1,000 years ago, man. You need to let it go. But yeah, that's the English, man. They really they live their history for better or worse. So this is all collected in the Domesday Book, not Doomsday. Again, though the British may pronounce it that way because they're dramatic. Um, this is a detailed account of all the property under William's conquest, both lay and ecclesiastical, um, so that he knew what he could get with taxes. Basically, it was just a big census book. So on the one hand, it's kind of boring, but on the other, it does give us an insight into what England looked like at the time because of how detailed it is. And also, it's still around. It's in the Tower of London to this day, and it's, as you can see, it's still in pretty decent shape. I mean, I've got textbooks that look worse than that. um, yeah, so it's in pretty decent shape. It gives an account of basically everything in England, at least the parts of England that were under William's control. So yeah, it's pretty neat. Oh, okay, let's get a little further. Oh, gracious. All right. So there were a couple of church movements to try to make things in Europe a little more peaceful, to try to stem all these, not even the wars, not even like they weren't looking at William invading England and be like, oh, we got to stop this. But like the vassals would just be constantly fighting each other or just going through the countryside and murdering people. Um, so the church did some movements to try to curb this. So we have the peace of God. Um, this was meant to stop local lords from just murdering farmers, women, and children, just non-combatants, um, on threat of excommunication. Which again, if you're a lord and you've got, all this land and all these people that are supposed to listen to you, and also all these other lords that are essentially your allies slash rivals, if you get excommunicated, you're dead. Your people can rise up against you. Your army no longer has to listen to you, which again means they can rise up against you. Your former allies can now come in and take your stuff and or kill you. Um, so that's a very big threat. The truce of God. This was a similar policy to the peace of God, but this was meant to keep knights and vassals from constantly murdering each other, because they would get into little fights and then it would escalate to huge bouts of violence to the point that they would be like running armies across fields and stuff, which isn't good for growing things and will often end up with villages being burned down. So this at least made it so that the knights and vassals would fight less, at least on certain days of the year, Lent, Sundays, Fridays, that kind of thing. So it's not curbing the violence between the knights and vassals too much, but it's at least like putting some brakes on it, which, I guess is better than nothing. Also, it wasn't just the church, but the kings as well. With the kings becoming stronger, they wanted to keep their vassals from fighting each other, because, well, the vassals are the ones that have your armies. And if your armies are constantly fighting each other, that means your armies are not going to be at full strength once you finally go off to war. Just imagine, like, I was going to say like the Army and Navy fighting, but like just imagine if the various army stations from the various forts were like actively fighting each other. Not just, oh, well, this, the guys at Fort Bragg are better than the guys at Fort whatever, and they're going to have a football game to prove it. No, they're like actively shooting at each other, but like out in public, out in the middle of a city. So not only are they hurting the military readiness, but they're endangering the people. So this, again, not only would mean that the army wouldn't be killing itself, but it would also make the countryside safer. So gradually we're making Europe a little bit better. There's the Book of Kells again. I guess I just wanted to include that since we were talking about the church. So as the roads became gradually safer, pilgrimages became a thing that could happen again. Again, a pilgrimage is a journey for religious reasons. You're going to go to a place, typically a holy site. Most often, if it's a pilgrimage, you're going to Jerusalem, more often than not, because that's where Jesus hung out and did stuff. Other times it would be like to your local church or monastery, because that's where the relics are, which we've talked about a little bit earlier. But by and large, these especially, they'd be going to Jerusalem. So due to how split up the European lands were, as the pilgrims made their way through Europe, they had to stop at basically every new province and pay a toll to get through, because if you're in charge of this land, you're going to do what you can to make money, and besides taxing the people, you're going to try to get money from the people who are coming through your land, and the way you do that is to have a toll road, money to keep the road running, because you don't have gas tax. That's not a thing yet. So when the Christians, or the pilgrims, the Christian pilgrims, were making their way towards Jerusalem, once they crossed into Muslim lands, they of course had to pay a toll going into the Muslim lands. But once they were there, that was it. The Muslim lands are largely unified, and once they got past, the initial border, they were pretty much set. They could go to Jerusalem without any more checkpoints. And I did mention this before. The churches took advantage of this idea. They set up basically mini pilgrimages to these various churches for the relics, even different shrines within the same church for different saints. So you would even have within the church little mini pilgrimages where you would go in, and again, if you know anything about a Catholic church, just sort of the Stations of the Cross situation, where you go, it's usually clockwise. You go to the left and you stop at the first and you say a little prayer, and then you go to the next section and you say a little prayer. That, but with these shrines for each of the saints. And you're supposed to give a little offering in each one, but they've got 5, 6, 7 shrines. You're giving a lot of little offerings before you get out of there. And needless to say, the church is keeping all those offerings. They're not just disappearing and going to heaven. So they're making a lot of money, needless to say. And we'll get more into that a little bit later as well. So as Europe became more structured, identified its Christian ideal, it also started to recognize the others that were not European and not the, at least sort of Christian that they were. There was, of course, the schism, this break between Roman Orthodoxy, or what will become Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodoxy. And also it indicated just quite how aggressive Western Orthodoxy was, because the reason the schism happened was this treatise that was sent that was like, hey, we're doing all these reforms. You have to do all these reforms. And the East was just like, no, we're not. That's, you can't come over here and make us change our church just because you guys did. Also, with the Normans attacking the Byzantines and the gradual push of Islam out of Spain were also examples of this aggressive stance that Europeans took on what were considered, outside forces. But also, as the church began to reform, it started to identify heretics within its ranks. The heretics were either imprisoned and reformed, or, quote, removed from the body of true believers. And that is to say, killed in various horrific ways. Most often, burned at the stake, because that was just the most common and easy way to take care of it. But sometimes, it was hanging, or drowning, or crushing with stones, or, whatever. But burning at the stake was a pretty common one. And imprisoned and reformed means tortured until they say the right things. And this wasn't even like, these weren't even witch trials. This was just, oh, you believe the wrong thing. You're a Christian, but you're not the right kind of Christian. So we're going to torture you until you say what we say. Or we're going to burn you to death. All right, we might be able to finish this chapter today. So there was this medieval warm period, 775 to 1275, a nice little time period, where there was warmer temperatures throughout Europe. Vineyards were reported as far north as England, which obviously pissed off the French, because, the French and English, right? Which led to more prosperity across Europe. More water mills, more windmills, more agriculture meant higher population. Higher population meant more urban living. So, hey, we're getting cities back, more trade, and hey, we got a money-based economy again. Before this, since the fall of Rome, they've been bartering. If you want a pound of wheat, you got to trade something of equal value. And I don't mean coins. I mean, not tomatoes, because those came from North America. Shoot. Some other thing that's worth that, that amount. So we're getting back to a money-based economy, which is, a little bit easier for trade. Also, primogeniture. Primogeniture is another big word that you are probably going to need to know. Hint, hint. This is pretty simple. This is, your basic, what you probably think of when you think of kings and succession and, who gets all the stuff. This is where the eldest son gets the land and title, and everyone else is just kind of out of luck. Now, in this case, the other sons were left out in the cold, but because they were raised as nobles, they had been raised as warriors. So, while they were not given land and noble titles, they still had the training, and therefore just kind of wandering knights, which led to a lot of violence because they had the training, but they didn't have anything to do with the training, so they just wandered around and started fights. Or they become mercenaries and start fights. You know. That's where you get the, wandering swordsman, typically a younger member of a noble family that, they lost out and now they're wandering around trying to figure out how to make money with the skills that they have. Here is a fantastic illustrated representation of primogeniture. You've got the noble at the top, the noble father, I suppose. And then the eldest son here gets all the stuff, whereas the younger son gets nothing, and he's very sad about it. So, there you go. Obviously, a lot of the pictures, I'm just like, I just looked up the name and went to images and see what I get. And this was one of the first ones for primogeniture. I was like, this is perfect. Yep, we're just going to go with that. So, there you go, primogeniture. After the 1060s, access to the Holy Land was restricted due to the anti-infidel policies of the Seljuk Turks because, well, again, the Seljuks were much less chill with Jews and Christians than the Islamic laws under Muhammad and his immediate successors. So Pope Gregory VII called for a crusade to liberate the Holy Land from the pagans because, for the Christians, anything that's not Christian and really the right kind of Christian are considered pagans because you will literally hear Protestants call Catholics pagans. So, yeah. Even though, again, if you look into any of the Islamic doctrine, it's like, this is just more Abrahamic God just added on. Anyway, obviously the Byzantine Empire was totally cool with a crusade happening because it meant that there would be a lot of Western mercenaries that would come and help them push back the Turks. So for them, it was just like, hey, free muscle, great. So at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II whipped up fervor against the Muslims, using inflammatory language, breeding hate against the enemy, all sorts of just very, dehumanizing language, treating them like, well, less than human and monsters and blah, blah, blah. Also, those that went on crusade were promised remission of sins, right to keep the lands that they took, postponement of debts back at home. So it was not just like your God-given duty to go on crusade, but also it was it had some pretty good perks. Now, unfortunately, there were a lot of really excited people wanting to go ahead and have the crusade happen. And it led to a number of, I'd say false crusades. There was the Peasants' Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit. Just a bunch of just random people decided to get up and go to the Holy Land and take it for themselves before the knights even got started, and they all got slaughtered. There's also the Children's Crusade. Do I have it here in the book? Where do we have it? Peter the Hermit. There was also the so-called Children's Crusade, um, where this guy was like, "Hey, I'm just gonna march to Jerusalem, and the children will come, and we'll just take over Jerusalem through the power of God." And rather than march over land, he's like, "Oh, we're just gonna march through the Mediterranean Sea, and it will part like the Red Sea." And they marched into the Mediterranean Sea and got wet. And a local shipmaster was like, "Hey, we'll give you a ride for free. This is a noble task." So all the kids got on the ship, and they sailed off and were sold into slavery. So didn't work out real well. Also, during all this crusade fervor, there are all kinds of pogroms happening, and if you're not familiar with what a pogrom is, that's just violence against Jews, persecuting Jews for being there. Like, "Oh, you're not Christian, let's murder your people and burn your houses down." Yeah, we're going to see a lot of that going forward, because, hey, they exist, and they're in a Christian majority region, so they're going to get murdered. Here is the Council of Claremont, I believe. Another fantastic medieval painting of what is, size perception here. Because look at this crowd of people and then these giants sitting around the table. Or really around the crowd of people. All right. Yeah, we can totally finish this chapter today, and then we'll be able to start chapter 9 next week. Right. 1096, we had thousands of Western Crusaders gathering outside of Constantinople. The emperor was initially kind of worried because, well, for one, it was a lot more people than he was expecting, and also they were like these big, sweaty, bearded, very, 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 how did I put it? Yeah, full of fervor. Like, they were damn near rabid with anticipation. So he had them swear fealty to him so they wouldn't overrun his city. Before they crossed the Bosporus Straits, which is between Constantinople and what at that time was now essentially the Islamic lands. So in 1097, they crossed, took the city of Nicaea, and handed it over to Alexius. So that was nice. They made their way towards Jerusalem, set up crusader states as they took more land, which were essentially little, European cities. However, they stalled at Antioch and really lost a lot of momentum. However, they supposedly found the holy lance that was used to pierce Christ's side, the spear that was used to, make sure Jesus was dead. They stabbed him, and supposedly blood and water came out, which I guess was still around 1,000 years later, and just so happened to be outside of Antioch. I don't know what the story behind that was. So this reinvigorated them. They captured Antioch in 1098 and slaughtered all the men inside the walls. Then in 1099 they took Jerusalem, and according to one particular chronicler, they slaughtered 10,000 Muslim men, women, and children who had taken refuge inside the temple, because typically in war at this time, temples were considered like safe havens. If you go inside a temple, you're to be left alone, or at least not murdered. But they were too busy enjoying themselves and murdering people, so they just rolled into the temple and murdered, at the very least, a lot of people on the floor of the temple in Jerusalem. So, here we have the movement of the Crusades, and moving over the walls there. All right, let's hit the aftermath before we run out of time. Growing dynamism, and was also a pressure valve. So these various disenfranchised knights who were not able to get any land or titles because of primogeniture were now able to go out and go on crusade. So this was the big thing. This was the thing to do as a knight. If you were not the oldest son in your family and your older brother managed to not die of, whatever diseases, you could still go and do something. You could still go and make something of yourself, and not just be, a wandering warrior that just bullies people. Which, knights were still bullies, but we'll get to that later. However, this kingdom of Jerusalem that was set up was ruled by a minority of Christian knights. Most of them went home, and for the most part, it was still the Muslim inhabitants. It was not like this new Christian utopia out in the Middle East. It was just like a couple of dudes running the place and the everybody else. And the everybody else were the Muslims that have been living there for several hundred years now. Which you can see here, Armenians, Sicilia, Edessia, Antioch, Tripoli, and then Jerusalem. And once they got to Jerusalem, they were done. That was the main goal. So, by the time we get to the end of this period, these Central Middle Ages, Europe was becoming defined. It was becoming closer to what we think of as Europe. It was no longer just in the shadow of the Roman Empire. It was something of itself. It was becoming powerful. It was somewhat unified. Obviously, Europe's always going to fight itself. The papacy was now above kings and emperors. It was its own thing. It was able to, if necessary, kick the legs out from under kings and nobles, if they were trying to, bully the papacy, bully the church. And at the least, managed to keep Europe from falling into an all-out war, to keep, to keep the fall of Rome from happening again. Not that that was generally what caused the fall of Rome, but, But also the others, particularly Islam, because they were the most powerful, did allow for a focus point, this outside point to rally against, so that the inner conflicts, and because there are always inner conflicts, we saw all through this chapter, the Vikings and the Norman invasion of England and all this other stuff. Obviously, there's still internal conflicts in Europe, and there will remain internal conflicts in Europe. But with the whole Crusades and focusing on Islam, and not just the Crusades, but the gradual push of the Islamic wars out of Spain, there was some outside force for Europe to focus on, so that they wouldn't focus so much on the issues they were having internally. Which, unfortunately, is a very common thing for a lot of powers, is to have some outside force to focus everybody on, so they don't notice the issues they're having at home. But, I'm not going to go too much into that. Anyway, that's chapter 8. I'm glad we finished that. So we can start chapter 9, the Gothic High Middle Ages, next week. I guess we're only gonna be able to do chapter 9. Usually I'll do chapter 9 and chapter 10 before the final, because that's like all of the Middle Ages. But I don't know if we'll be able to do that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'll see you on Monday, and we'll start chapter 9. So yeah, have a good weekend.